Imagine you are holding a clay tablet in your hands. It is cracked along the edges, dark with the color of thousands of years of dust and burial. The writing on it is pressed in small wedge-shaped marks, and most people who have ever looked at it assumed it was just another religious story, another myth carved by a primitive people trying to explain a world they did not understand. But then, a team of researchers sat down and compared what was written on that tablet to modern geological surveys of ancient coastlines, deep-sea sediment cores, and satellite imaging of sunken land masses. And what they found made them go completely silent. The story on that tablet was not mythology. It was a record, a memory, and it was accurate in ways that should have been impossible for the people who wrote it.
This is not a fringe idea buried in the corners of the internet. The scientific community has been quietly grappling with this discovery for decades, and the evidence keeps mounting. Over 200 flood narratives exist across cultures that had absolutely no contact with each other. 200 separate civilizations on every inhabited continent, all describing the same catastrophic event with the same specific details. The same rising waters, the same darkness, the same desperate attempt to preserve life, the same landing on a mountain or high ground when the water finally receded.
What are the odds that 200 separate cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of time, all invented the same story independently? Mathematically, statistically, logically, the answer is that they did not. Something happened, something so catastrophic, so world-altering, that every culture on Earth tried to preserve the memory of it. And the most remarkable part is not that they remembered it. The most remarkable part is how accurately they remembered it.
Today, we are going to go through 10 of those ancient texts one by one. We are going to look at what they describe in specific detail. And then we are going to look at what modern geology, archaeology, climatology, and genetic science have found about the same time period. Because in almost every case, the ancient writers knew things they could not possibly have known, unless they were there.
The first text is the oldest written flood account on Earth, and it predates the Bible by over 1,000 years. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was pressed into clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BC, though the events it describes are believed to be far older. The story centers on a man named Utnapishtim, who was warned by a god that a catastrophic flood is coming. He is given specific instructions to build a large vessel, seal it, load it with family and animals, and wait out the destruction. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. He releases a dove to test whether dry land has appeared. The dove returns. He waits. He releases it again. This time, it does not come back. He opens the vessel and finds himself on a mountaintop.
What makes this scientifically compelling is a single detail buried in the account that most people overlook. The text describes the waters coming not only from the sky, but from below the earth. The fountains of the deep burst open, water rising from underground. That is not a poetic flourish. That is a geological description of what happens during a catastrophic glacial lake outburst flood, which is exactly the kind of event geologists have now documented occurring at the end of the last ice age, between roughly 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. When massive glacial dams collapsed, they did not just release surface water, they triggered subterranean pressure releases that caused water to erupt from the ground in ways that would have looked, to anyone watching, like the Earth itself was breaking open. It is one of the most photographed artifacts in human history, and seeing the actual cuneiform writing pressed into that ancient clay makes the claim feel exactly what it is: real, physical, and impossible to dismiss. The tablet was discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in the 1850s and translated by George Smith, who reportedly ran through the halls of the British Museum shouting when he realized what it said, because he recognized immediately that the story on that tablet matched almost word for word the story of Noah's Ark, and this tablet was 1,000 years older. What he did not know, and what we now understand, is that both accounts may be drawing from the same much older oral tradition, a memory so important that multiple cultures preserved it separately, each adding their own cultural framing but keeping the core details intact. The second text takes us to ancient India, and it is called the Shatapatha Brahmana, one of the oldest Sanskrit prose texts in existence, dating to around 700 BC, though drawing from oral traditions far older. In this account, a figure named Manu is approached by a small fish who warns him that a great flood is coming. The fish, later revealed to be the god Vishnu in disguise, instructs Manu to build a boat. The fish grows larger and larger as the years pass, eventually becoming enormous. And on the day the flood arrives, Manu ties his boat to the fish's horn and is pulled through the rising waters to safety on a northern mountain. What makes this scientifically interesting is the staging of the flood as described in the text. It does not come all at once. It rises slowly at first, then catastrophically. That specific pattern of gradual onset followed by sudden, overwhelming inundation is exactly what geologists have documented in the flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 7,500 years ago. Scientific research has shown that what is now the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake sitting well below sea level. As Mediterranean waters rose following the end of the last ice age, a natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus eventually gave way. The result was a catastrophic inflow of saltwater that flooded an enormous freshwater basin almost overnight in geological terms. The people living on those fertile shores had no warning. They ran, and the ones who survived carried the memory with them. The third text is the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian account that is even older than Gilgamesh in its origin, preserved on a single fragmentary tablet dated to around 1600 BC, though believed to record a story far more ancient. In it, a king named Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki of a decision by the gods to destroy humanity through a great flood. The text is damaged and incomplete, but the surviving fragments describe the flood in terms that are geologically specific. The wind attacks with force. The storms come all at once. The text uses language that climatologists and atmospheric scientists have used to describe what rapid deglaciation at the end of the Younger Dryas period would have looked and felt like from the ground. The Younger Dryas was a rapid return to Ice Age conditions that ended around 9700 BC, in a warming event so fast it has shocked modern climate scientists who study it. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. The atmospheric and oceanic disruption that followed would have produced exactly the kind of simultaneous catastrophic weather events that Sumerian scribes recorded as the gods attacking all at once. The fourth text brings us to the other side of the world entirely, to the Mayan sacred creation document known as the Popol Vuh, written down in the 16th century from oral traditions that stretch back thousands of years. The Popol Vuh describes a flood sent by the gods to destroy an earlier race of wooden humans who had displeased them. The survivors of this flood describe the sky coming down, darkness covering everything, and a resin-like substance falling from above. Modern volcanology has a name for this. When a major volcanic eruption occurs, it ejects sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere. The ash mixes with water vapor and descends as acidic precipitation that feels and looks sticky, almost resinous on surfaces. And the darkness they describe is consistent with a volcanic winter caused by stratospheric aerosol loading blocking sunlight for weeks or months at a time. The Mayan ancestors were not speaking in metaphor. They were describing what they saw falling from the sky during a catastrophic volcanic event tied to the same global climate upheaval that is now being studied through ice cores and sediment deposits around the world. The fifth text is one that most people in the Western world have never heard of, and that obscurity is part of what makes it so compelling. It is called the Oira Linda Book, a manuscript of disputed origin but fascinating content, purporting to preserve ancient Frisian records from northern Europe. It describes the flooding and sinking of a land called Otland in what is now the North Sea, placing the event around 2200 BC. For a long time, this text was dismissed entirely. Then, modern bathymetric mapping of the North Sea floor revealed something that changed the conversation permanently. Beneath the shallow waters of the North Sea lies Doggerland, a real landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe. At the height of the last ice age, this was fertile, inhabited territory. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, Doggerland was gradually submerged. The final catastrophic inundation event, believed to have been triggered by a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway called the Storred Slide around 8,200 years ago, would have sent a wall of water across the remaining Doggerland plains, destroying any settlements and driving survivors inland. Archaeological evidence of human habitation has been recovered from the North Sea floor. Fishing trawlers have pulled up ancient tools, animal bones, and human remains from areas that are now 30 meters underwater. The people of Doggerland were real. The flood that took their homeland was real. And somewhere in the oral traditions of Northern European cultures, the memory of it survived long enough to be written down. Here is a screenshot of the bathymetric map of Doggerland published in peer-reviewed archaeological literature, showing the coastline of Europe as it appeared before the flooding. Let that visual sit on screen for a moment, because when you see a map of a sunken landmass and then read an ancient text describing exactly that landmass sinking beneath the sea, the word myth suddenly feels less accurate than the word memory.
The sixth text is one that was removed from the official biblical canon, and that decision has fascinated scholars ever since. It is called the Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew text that survives most completely in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, where it was never removed and is still considered sacred scripture. The Book of Enoch describes a period before the flood in extraordinary atmospheric and geological detail. It describes windows of the sky opening and the deep below the earth responding simultaneously. It describes a period of total darkness following the flood that lasted for an extended time. It describes the earth itself shaking and changing shape. Each of these details has a corresponding scientific explanation rooted in what geologists now understand about the end of the last ice age. The dual-source flooding, water from sky and ground simultaneously, corresponds to glacial outburst events. The extended darkness corresponds to the stratospheric aerosol injection that follows major volcanic activity triggered by crustal rebound, which is the process by which the Earth's crust shifts and adjusts as enormous weight from ice sheets is suddenly removed. When you take off billions of tons of ice from a continental landmass relatively quickly, the crust bounces back upward, a process called isostatic rebound, and this movement can trigger fault lines and volcanic activity in ways that geologists have now documented extensively. The Book of Enoch described these effects thousands of years before the science of plate tectonics existed to explain them. The seventh text comes from ancient Persia and the Zoroastrian tradition. The Bundahisht is a cosmological text that describes a great winter and global catastrophe preceding a period of renewal. What stands out in this text is the description of the catastrophe as both frozen and flooded, ice and water together. That specific combination, a world that was first frozen and then drowned as the ice melted, is exactly the sequence the geological record shows us for the transition out of the last ice age. The ancient Persians did not have climate science, they didn't have ice cores or ocean sediment data, but they described the correct sequence of events: freeze first, then flood. That is not a guess, that is a memory.
The eighth text brings us to Guatemala and the manuscript Quiché, another Mayan source that supplements the Popol Vuh with additional flood detail. This document specifically mentions the mountains shaking before the waters came. Seismic activity as a precursor to flooding. And again, this is not metaphor. The process of glacial isostatic rebound that we discussed in the context of the Book of Enoch produces exactly this sequence. As ice sheets collapsed and sea levels rose, the reduction of weight on continental plates triggered seismic activity across the globe. The mountains would have shaken. The people who felt those earthquakes and then watched the waters rise in the days and weeks that followed preserved the connection between the two events in their stories, because to them, the shaking and the flooding were part of the same event, and scientifically, they were right. The ninth text is perhaps the most remarkable of all, because it has been scientifically validated more rigorously than any other ancient flood account on Earth. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, some of which have now been formally studied by linguists and marine geographers, describe the flooding of specific coastal locations around Australia in precise geographical detail. In a landmark study published in the Australian Geographer Journal, researchers analyzed 21 Aboriginal stories from different locations around Australia's coastline. Each story described a time when the sea level was significantly lower than it is today, when land that is now underwater was dry and habitable. Each story described flooding events that permanently changed the landscape.
The researchers then mapped the specific details of each story against known sea level data for those coastal locations at different points in time. The results were extraordinary. The stories aligned with documented sea level changes that occurred between roughly 7,000 and 13,000 years ago. Aboriginal oral traditions had preserved accurate geographical memories across 400 generations without the use of any written language. As one researcher put it, it is almost unimaginable that people would transmit stories about islands that are currently underwater accurately across 400 generations. But they did, and modern science confirmed it.
The 10th text closes this journey in the most unexpected place. The Kolbrin Bible is a largely unknown collection of ancient manuscripts, part of which claims to preserve Egyptian accounts of a catastrophic event involving not just flooding, but a disturbance in the sky. Whatever you believe about the more extraordinary claims in this text, what is striking is the consistency of the environmental description with the other 9 texts we have examined. Darkness, water, shaking earth, winds attacking from every direction, survivors fleeing to high ground, animals behaving strangely, the sea retreating before the flood came, which is precisely how a tsunami begins. The text describes survivors looking back at a coastland they would never see again, people writing down the worst thing their civilization had ever experienced, hoping that whoever came after them would understand what had happened and why the world they inherited was so different from the world their grandparents had described. And that is the thing that connects all 10 of these texts more powerfully than any single geological or atmospheric detail. They are all written from the same emotional place. They are all written by people who survived something that ended a world, who watched the landscape they knew disappear under water that never came back, who rebuilt on higher ground and tried to explain to their children and their children's children what the world had looked like before.
Now step back and look at all 10 texts together. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, the Shatapatha Brahmana from ancient India, the Eridu Genesis from Sumer, the Popol Vuh from the Maya, the Oeralinda book from Northern Europe, the Book of Enoch from the ancient Hebrew tradition, the Bundahishn from Persia, the manuscript Quiche from Guatemala, the Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, and the Kolbrin's ancient Egyptian passages. 10 sources, 10 different cultures, 10 different languages, 10 different continents and coastlines. And they all describe the same 5 things: water rising from below the earth, not only from the sky, extended darkness lasting days or weeks, the earth shaking before and during the flood, survivors reaching safety on high ground, a world so transformed by the event that it was unrecognizable to those who came after. 5 specific details in 10 separate accounts from cultures with no known contact with each other. That is not coincidence. That is not mythology. That is the fingerprint of a real event preserved in human memory across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Modern science has given us a name for the time period these texts appear to be describing. The transition out of the Younger Dryas, roughly between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, was one of the most geologically violent periods in recent human history. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet over several thousand years. Entire land masses disappeared underwater. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were suddenly gone. The climate swung violently between freeze and thaw. Volcanic activity increased as crustal pressure changed with the loss of ice sheet weight. And the humans who were alive during this period, the people who watched their world transformed beyond recognition, wrote it down in every way they knew how: in clay, in stone, in bark, in song, in stories told around fires and passed from grandparent to grandchild for hundreds of generations.
Here's the question that no scientist has cleanly answered, the question that sits at the center of all this evidence and refuses to go away. If these stories are purely mythological, invented by ancient peoples to explain natural phenomena they did not understand, then why do they all describe water rising from below the ground? Rain is observable. Anyone who has ever watched a storm can describe rain. But water erupting from underground is a geological event. It is not something you invent to explain a thunderstorm. It is something you describe because you watched it happen. The fact that cultures across the world, with no connection to each other, all independently included this specific detail in their flood accounts, is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. Because there is only one explanation that holds. They were all describing the same thing. A catastrophic flooding event so massive, so transformative, and so traumatic that the humans who survived it carried the memory of it in their bloodlines and their stories for 10,000 years. And when we finally developed the science to look back that far in geological time, what we found was not myth, it was not metaphor, it was a match. The texts have been there all along, sitting in museums, buried in libraries, preserved in the oral traditions of indigenous communities on every continent, waiting for us to stop calling them stories and start calling them what they actually are, evidence. Not of the supernatural, but of something arguably more astonishing. Of human beings who watched their entire world get swallowed by the sea and who refused to let anyone who came after them forget it. That refusal, that insistence on remembering, is what these 10 texts have in common above everything else. And the fact that they were right, that the world they described before the flood was real, that the lands they named are now sitting under hundreds of feet of ocean, verified by the very science that once dismissed them, that is the part of this story that changes everything you thought you knew. The flood was not a myth. The people who survived it were real. And what they left behind, carved into clay and pressed into bark and passed through 400 generations of human memory, was the most important thing they had. The truth.